This is Chapter 15, Section 3, Deficits and National Debt. As we are going through today's information, I recommend that you take notes so you'll have the information for your check for understanding, as well for your test at the end of this unit. So federal deficit and debt is our topic, and we need to define a couple of things real quick. So federal spending falls into one of three categories: a balanced budget, which is pretty self-explanatory. That is where you are spending what you are bringing in. A budget surplus is when you spend less than you're taking in, so that means that you'd have money left over. And a budget deficit is when you spend more than you're taking in. So you are spending more than you currently have and overspending the amount. So since 1970, a surplus was recorded only between 1998 and 2001. Now, a deficit is different than debt, and we'll talk about that difference in just a moment. Okay, a budget deficit or budget surplus refers to only 1 year. So when we're talking about deficits and surplus, we're not talking about debt. That's a totally different thing. We're only looking at what happened with the federal budget within that year. So annual deficits contribute to national debt. So if you continue to spend more than you are bringing in, then you are going to accumulate debt. Okay, so one more time, just to remember, budget deficit is spending more than you currently are bringing in, but it doesn't mean that you're necessarily in debt, because maybe if you had a surplus in the past, you might have some money set aside. But national debt, on the other hand, is the total amount of money that a government owes, and that's basically when you have too many years of this budget deficit that accumulate into loss of money or being in debt and needing to pay somebody back. Causes of a deficit. So again, we're talking about deficit, not debt. Things that can lead to a deficit are national emergencies, things like wars or foreign attacks. The second thing is need for public goods and services like interstate highway systems, airports. The third is stabilization of the economy. So, for example, when we were in the Great Depression, FDR introduced the New Deal, which was spending money to stimulate the economy. And finally, the fourth one is the role of government in society. And we've seen a lot of this expand since the New Deal, where the government provides more safety nets for people, things like Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, and other programs that would benefit people. So how do we raise money to help combat this deficit spending? The government can borrow money by issuing bonds through the Department of Treasury. And a bond is basically an IOU. So it's a piece of paper issued by the government to whomever has purchased it. And the money that's used to purchase that IOU then goes to the government, and the government can spend it. Now, the person who purchased that bond, or the investor, has to wait a certain number of years before they can cash it in. And when they cash it in, if it's just at that maturity rate or a year's, they get their money back. Now, if they wait a little bit longer past the maturity date, then it also gains a higher interest rate. So the longer you let that bond sit, after it matures, you gain more interest. And this is how people would earn money. So there are different types of bonds. A savings bond is probably the most common among individuals. Some of you may have savings bonds that maybe people gave to you over your lifetime. I know that when I was a kid, savings bonds were super popular. Generally, they take about 20 years to mature, depending on what type of savings bond you have purchased. And then once that maturity date is reached, it continues to gain interest. Treasury bills are short-term bonds that mature in less than 1 year. Treasury notes are bonds that mature between 2 and 10 years, and Treasury bonds are issued for 30 years. Now, usually the longer the maturity dates are, the higher the interest rate. So if you look at these 4 different types of bonds, you could probably say that your Treasury bonds are going to have the highest interest rates because you're waiting the longest period of time for them to mature. The majority of national debt is owned by foreign investors, primarily in Japan and China. So a lot of central banks within foreign countries have purchased a lot of bonds for the national government and lent the government money. So now we're going to switch gears and we're going to talk about debt. Remember, debt and deficit are different. So national debt is the total accumulation of government deficits and surpluses over time. So this is looking at how much money do we owe after a certain period of time. And so we're going to look at not only the deficits, but the surpluses as well and where that leads us. The government can also borrow from trust funds such as Social Security, government pension funds, etc. The problem with this, though, is that if the government dips into these programs like Social Security, then it could eventually put these programs at risk because they may have had enough financing before to cover future generations, but if that money is spent in other areas, then it no longer will have that income it needs to survive as a program. So they're held for specific purposes to be expanded at a future date. All right, so we can see the national debt clock, and this is where you can see that. And if you just go to usdebtclock.org, you can see this number continuing to accumulate. Every now and then you will notice that it might decrease, or it does not always increase, but most of the time it just continues to rise. But that's an interesting tool to look at. There's a couple of other economic indicators here as well. So it tells you U.S. retirees, U.S. disabled, Medicaid, Medicare, millionaires, food stamp recipients, median income, union workers, things like that. So there's a lot of really interesting data here that you can come back and look at on your own. And then here also you can see information about GDP, which is something we've talked about. This is our current GDP. Notice it is changing constantly. So just an interesting place that you can look. You can also go to your state debt clock. So if you click on Alabama, it is also going to show you our state GDP, our debt, in-state revenue, spending, debt per citizen. All of that is there, unemployment, things like that. So kind of a neat tool to be able to look at world debt clock so you can see different countries and how they stand compared to the United States. So that is a fun tool, but also kind of a depressing tool to look at. So what is the effect of the debt on the economy? National debt can have positive or negative effects on the economy. Typically, when we think about debt, we think about debt in a negative way, but debt can be positive. It can help to stimulate the government because if the government is using money to put towards its citizens, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does continue to increase our debt. So that is kind of positive and negative. There's also the crowding out effect when the government outbids private bond interest rates to gain loanable funds. And we'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about the Federal Reserve. But basically here the government is giving better interest rates than the private sector is able to. Attempts to control deficits and debts. All attempts to control deficits and debt have failed, and Congress is still continuing to struggle to control the national debt. And we see this come up quite often, especially whenever there's a government shutdown. Usually the issue is how can we continue to increase this deficit when we owe so many people so much money. One thing that has become very predominant is the fact that taxes are being used less and less to be able to cover programs for citizens and more so to cover the interest that we are having to pay back on our loans.